Subcommittee will come to order. Thank you, Ranking Member Blumenauer, subcommittee members, and certainly our witnesses here today. Today's hearing is an important opportunity to discuss the set of trade preferences programs scheduled to expire in 2025, including the African Growth and Opportunity Act, AGOA, U.S. trade preference programs for Haiti, and the Nepal Trade Preference Program. These programs are designed to foster economic growth in some of the least developed countries and economies in the world, while strengthening U.S. leadership and influence abroad. This is especially important as countries like China and Russia seek to spread their malign influence globally. In April, this committee took an important first step by passing the Generalized System of Preferences Reform Act, GSP, which would provide the most significant reform of the GSP program since it began. Last month, I introduced legislation with the support of 20 committee Republicans to reauthorize the miscellaneous tariff bill process as well. Now we must build on this effort by considering reform and renewal of our trade preference program set to expire in 2025. Since its inception in 2000, the AGOA program has been the cornerstone of U.S. trade and economic engagement with Sub-Saharan Africa. The program has two important elements. One, duty-free access to the U.S. market, and two, eligibility criteria to ensure beneficiary countries meet U.S. standards in key areas like human rights, governance, rule of law, and fair treatment for foreign companies and exporters. These elements are designed to support sub-Saharan African economies, develop trade capacity, and strengthen U.S. relationships with beneficiary countries. Today's hearing is the continuation of a deliberate Ways and Means Committee process regarding AGOA renewal, which has included roundtables, member visits to AGOA countries, and now a public hearing. I encourage all interested stakeholders to participate in this hearing through submissions for the record. A few key areas we should address through AGOA renewal include: 1, pursuing reciprocal market access for American farmers, workers, and businesses in sub-Saharan Africa. 2, addressing the process of graduation from AGOA when a country surpasses the per capita income threshold. And 3, transforming AGOA to encourage more value-added manufacturing on the African continent while ensuring third countries are not receiving disproportionate benefits. But first, we must ensure that participation in AGOA supports the development of science and rules-based standards in beneficiary countries, and use the annual review process to address any unfair treatment of U.S. ag products. All AGOA countries must provide fair market access to U.S. producers and manufacturers. In the case of countries that are prepared for that next step, we must pursue robust conversations to move such an agreement forward. I once again call on the Biden administration to develop a coherent, effective strategy for pursuing comprehensive trade agreements and seeking congressional approval of such agreements. It is well past time to resume negotiations of a comprehensive and enforceable trade agreement with Kenya, for example. My colleagues on both sides of the aisle agree on this. Kenya wants to step up and move on from a temporary unilateral preference program to a reciprocal, mutually beneficial relationship, and the only thing standing in the way is this current administration. When countries have reached the income level to graduate from the program, I hope we can consider common sense reforms to ensure they are not punished for success in economic development. Congress should consider creative solutions to prevent a graduation cliff and secure market access for our exporters. In each of these areas, improving access to African markets will support American workers, businesses, and farmers with little downside, since AGOA already provides generous access to the U.S. market. I'm eager to hear more about how Congress can encourage more value-added manufacturing on the African continent. African cotton should not be sent halfway across the globe to be made into fabric just to be sent back to Africa for final manufacturing. The people of Africa should be the beneficiaries of AGOA. Next, I'll turn to our Haiti trade preference programs. They were created by Congress through the Haitian Hemispheric Opportunity, through Partnership Encouragement, and the Haiti Economic Lift Program Acts. These programs provide important benefits to imports of textiles and apparel products from Haiti. The apparel industry supports thousands of jobs for the Haitian people, providing important economic stability in this time of uncertainty and unrest. I appreciate the leadership of Representative Wenstrup on this and look forward to working with him regarding next steps on the program. Also, The Nepal Trade Preference Program, which was established in 2015 to help Nepal recover from devastating earthquakes, is set to expire next year. I look forward to working with my colleagues and stakeholders on next steps for the program. I now recognize Ranking Member Mr. Blumenauer for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In the course of the hearing and the opening statements, you'll see there are a number of areas of agreement. The African Growth and Opportunity Act, also known as AGOA, and the Haitian Hemispheric Opportunity through Partnership and Encouragement Act, known as HOPE, are the cornerstone of U.S. trade policy with Sub-Saharan Africa and Haiti. The world, however, looks a lot different than it did when we enacted these programs decades ago. We now have years of experience to help understand what's working and what could be improved to raise living standards and bring more trade and investment both to Africa and the Caribbean. This hearing is the next step in the committee's ongoing review of American preference programs for Sub-Saharan Africa and Haiti, and there is clear bipartisan consensus on promoting trade and investment with Africa and the Caribbean. Then Chairman Neal set a strong tone for reviewing and improving these programs last Congress. This Congress, Chairman Jason Smith and Trade Subcommittee Mr. Adrian Smith have continued the committee's engagement, and this hearing today is an example of that. Their leadership is buttressed by several of my colleagues who've demonstrated continued commitment to Africa and Haiti. Chairman Smith mentioned some of his Republican colleagues. I would be remiss in not acknowledging Ms. Sewell, Ms. Moore, Mr. Evans, and Ms. Plaskett. And by the way, we wish continued recovery for Mr. Evans from his recent health problems. House Democrats have collectively shown an impenetrable commitment to the people of Sub-Saharan Africa and Haiti and will pursue the U.S. trade policies that advance prosperity for the people of these regions. I can speak confidently for House Democrats when I say we're firmly committed to reauthorization of AGOA and HOPE before their expiration next year. But reauthorizing the programs without improving them is a missed opportunity. The International Trade Commission's report on these programs demonstrated the urgent need for reform. It's important that our trade policies not only address long-term standing concerns, such as the low utilization rates in AGOA and labor violations in Haiti, which we've had some direct experience with, but also reflect the realities of today and pave the way for the future that we want to see. AGOA is a success story. It's opened new opportunities for economic engagement and has resulted in tens of thousands of jobs in Sub-Saharan Africa. It is critical Congress drives more investment to the continent, which creates opportunities for business both in Africa and the United States, as well for the larger diaspora. But as proud as we are of AGOA's achievements, it has not achieved all that we had hoped. As we consider the future of AGOA, we need to find creative ways to improve AGOA's utilization rate, increased value-added exports to the United States, and ensure that the benefits, in fact, flow to the African beneficiary countries. Africa has become a leader in addressing climate change. It's the site of key critical minerals and is quickly becoming a tech and innovation powerhouse. The creative sector, including TV, film, and music, are essential to the economies of the continent. Our American trade policy must reflect these developments and make the most of these opportunities. Our trade policies should recognize that certain African economies are more advanced and better integrated globally since AGOA was enacted, making it important to both consider AGOA graduation rules and developing mutually beneficial and reciprocal trade agreements with other Sub-Saharan African countries. Like Sub-Saharan Africa, the United States has a moral obligation to remain committed to the Haitian people. That obligation is now more important than ever. Haiti played a central role in the American Revolutionary War, as we're coming up to that 250th anniversary, where hundreds of Haitians fought for American independence, a feature that is little known in this country. And years later, Haiti would defeat the French and become the first black republic, influencing the rise of abolitionist and anti-colonial movements all over the world including the United States. But the record of the United States dealing with that revolution is shameful, and we're still paying the price. More importantly, the Haitian people are paying the price today. Many of Haiti's difficulties are because of a failure of American policy. That's why our preference programs for Haiti are so important. They provide an opportunity to help strengthen Haiti's economy and our trading relationship and remediate past wrongs. But we must acknowledge known problems with implementation of our preference programs, especially concerning labor rights violations and non-compliance with Haiti's national labor laws. The United States is selectively engaged in this space on issues like forced labor in the sugar sector, but there's much more to do. Like any trading relationship, our relationship with Haiti requires work on both sides, work to improve labor conditions, political stability, and diversify Haiti's export to the United States. Mr. Chairman, I'm convinced that today's hearing today is a step in that direction in this important work, and I appreciate you convening us and look forward to hearing from our witnesses.
Thank you, Mr. Blumenauer. I appreciate your input there. I now recognize Chairman of the full committee, Mr. Smith, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Smith and Ranking Member Blumenauer, for holding today's hearing. As the committee continues to examine how best to reauthorize the African Growth and Opportunity Act program, as well as strengthen other trade relationships with other nations. While we have time to address the reauthorization of AGOA before its September 2025 expiration, there is no sense in waiting. And so I appreciate the Trade Subcommittee keeping the drumbeat going. This hearing follows two bipartisan roundtables we held earlier this year, one with ambassadors from several of the Sub-Saharan Africa countries that participate in AGOA, and another with stakeholders that utilize AGOA in order to hear firsthand their perspectives on the program. The AGOA program has a successful track record of encouraging economic development in Sub-Saharan Africa and greater access for U.S. agriculture products in that region. Something I've watched closely over the years, having attended an AGOA forum in Gabon back in 2015. Under the program, American taxpayers have invested over $8 billion in trade-related activities in Africa over the past 20-plus years. Reauthorizing AGOA will ensure that American taxpayers get a positive return on their investment. It will also strengthen our economic relationship by making sure access to African markets for American exports, especially agriculture, is fair, and our trade relationships benefit American workers, farmers, and businesses. We also need to use our trade tools to counter the malign influence of countries like China and Russia. The AGOA program can play an important role in shoring up our critical supply chains to reduce our dependence on China. Earlier this year, the Ways and Means Committee approved trade reforms to counter China's growing military and economic influence around the world. This included the Generalized System of Preference Reform Act, introduced by Trade Subcommittee Chairman Smith, that would ban China from the GSP program and incentivize countries to grow their economies in partnership with the United States, not China. Those same reforms should be reflected in a reauthorization of AGOA. Meanwhile, our trade relationship with Haiti supports American manufacturing while encouraging stability in a nation that is currently suffering tremendous political and social turmoil. I have serious concerns with the violence that's taking place in Haiti, violence that recently took the lives of two individuals from my home state of Missouri who were in the country doing missionary work when they were killed by armed gang members. I want to thank Dr. Winstrup in particular for his leadership on this issue, as well as a number of other members of this committee on both sides of the aisle. I appreciate their recognition that U.S. businesses can be a force for good, particularly for a nation like Haiti, which is the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere. Thank you again, Chairman Smith and Ranking Member Blumenauer, and to all of our witnesses for being here today.
Thank you. I now have the pleasure of introducing our witnesses for today's hearing. Skip Richmond is the founder and co-CEO of DTRT Apparel Group. Next, we have Daniel Rundy. He is the Senior Vice President and Schreier Chair in Global Analysis at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. I'll yield to Dr. Winstrup to introduce our next witness.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'm pleased to introduce Mr. Auf Nasser, Vice President of Sourcing Center of Excellence and Supplier Diversity at Cintas Corporation, a proud Ohio company headquartered in the Cincinnati area. It's been a pleasure to watch Cintas grow through my lifetime. Cintas does great work across the United States every day, ensuring that millions of employees can go to work and perform their best by providing uniforms, supplies, first aid, and safety products, two things very important to me as a physician. Cintas is uniquely positioned to provide a key perspective in our discussion today as their global supply chain runs through both Sub-Saharan Africa and Haiti. As many of my colleagues here know, I've been a supportive leader on Haiti trade issues over the last few years, and I credit Cintas Corporation with bringing this critical issue to my attention as early as 2019, when they shared with me their support for renewing the Caribbean Basin Trade Partnership Act. Working with Representative Terry Sewell, that we got that bill done in 2020, and I'm looking forward to doing the same with the Hope Help preferences that are up for renewal right now. With that, Mr. Nasser, I want to welcome you and thank you for being here today.
Thank you, Dr. Winstrup. And we also have Margie Peters-Mujica. She is the Deputy Regional Director of Africa with the Solidarity Center. Again, thank you to all of our witnesses. I do want to say that your written statement will be made part of the record, and you each will have 5 minutes to deliver your remarks. Once that yellow light appears, if you wouldn't mind bringing the flight in for a landing to do what you can to stick within the 5 minutes. So with that, Mr. Richmond, you are recognized.
Thank you. I'd like to thank you for the opportunity to share our story and engage in this important conversation. My name is Skip Richmond. I was born and raised in the U.S., and I'm the founder of and co-CEO of DTRT Apparel Group, the largest apparel manufacturing company in West Africa. DTRT owns 2 factories in Ghana where we produce knitwear, primarily t-shirts, polos, hoodies, and other sportswear for large clothing brands in the U.S. and EU. We currently employ over 5,600 workers in Ghana, making over 50,000 garments per day. I'd like to give you a brief background of how our business got started and what we've accomplished so far. I'll also share with you some of the very exciting things we see ahead for our industry and the African continent in general that are dependent on a swift and timely long-term renewal of AGOA. First, how we got started. My co-founder, Mark Hanselt, and I first met in 2004 when we both went to work for a Hong Kong-based trading company. In 2005, we needed to find a factory outside China to produce some basketball uniforms. We learned about AGOA at that time, and we traveled to Madagascar looking for a factory to produce goods for us. At the conclusion of that visit, the decision was made for the company to establish our own garment factory in Madagascar. Unfortunately, Madagascar experienced a coup a few years later in 2009 and lost its access to AGOA benefits as a result. That experience reinforced for us the importance of finding a stable democratic home for our future work. In 2013, Mark and I co-founded DTRT Apparel. DTRT stands for Do the Right Thing. With 2 young children of my own at the time, I wanted to show my kids that it was possible to do good in the world and still make a good living. Although our industry has a bad reputation, justifiably in many cases, I don't know of any industry that holds so much power to do good in this world. What other industry can employ so many people so quickly from a socioeconomic population with such limited opportunity? Mark and I have always felt that a garment manufacturing business can make a healthy profit while treating our people and the planet with respect. We set out to harness the power of our industry to provide our local workers and their children a better future and to hopefully set an example for others in our industry. We chose Ghana as DTRT's home for several reasons. First, its geography. From our experience in East Africa, we encountered transit times of 50 to 60 days or longer to get finished goods from the factory to the U.S. That very long lead time limited the customers we could service. To provide the shortest possible lead time to customers and expand our market, we were specifically interested in looking at a country in West Africa to minimize that time. Second, but just as important, Ghana is arguably the most stable democracy on the continent, having achieved multiple consecutive peaceful transitions of power over the past 3 decades. After our experience with the coup in Madagascar, establishing operations in a stable democracy was very important to us. Another critically important factor in our decision to operate in Ghana was the fact that it was possible for us to pay wages high enough that the jobs we provide can truly lift our local workers and their families out of poverty. Contrary to many places around the world that trap workers in poverty with their very low wages, we are having an enormous positive impact on the lives of our local workers and their families in Ghana. This year, 2024, marks the 10-year anniversary of our first garment exports from Ghana to the U.S. As mentioned earlier, we currently employ over 5,600 people, 76% of whom are women. Almost 50% of our supervisors and managers are women, and that number is increasing every month. There isn't a pool of experienced workers in Ghana like exists in Asia. We train every new worker, and the training cost is significant. It typically takes 6 months for a new worker to become efficient enough for us to break even. Without the benefits of AGOA, we wouldn't be able to afford to train so many people. Renewing AGOA now is critical to maintain the momentum we are currently seeing. When we started our business 10 years ago, it was very difficult to get the attention from major brands to bring their business to West Africa. But today, there has never been more interest in sourcing from African manufacturers. The COVID pandemic highlighted how overdependent many companies remain on Chinese suppliers. Human rights issues and other geopolitical forces are forcing brands to seek alternatives to Asian suppliers like never before. Unlike years ago when barely any brands had Africa on their radar, today every major U.S. brand to whom we speak is exploring ways to source from Africa. Despite the many advantages that sourcing from AGOA-eligible countries offer, African manufacturers can currently only fulfill a small fraction of what these U.S. brands need. Africa must clear 2 key hurdles to be competitive with established global players in the long run: developing human capacity through training of skilled garment workers and building regional value chains to supply fabrics and accessories. That training is happening already at DTRT and others in the region via on-the-job instruction from experienced expats. But we can only afford to train because of the benefits of AGOA. The lack of existing input supply is where AGOA remains most essential. While a Chinese manufacturer can buy all their raw material inputs domestically, we must import nearly 100% of raw materials from overseas. Some of that investment is already happening, but uncertainty over when and for how long AGOA will be renewed limits and delays needed investment. The ROI on investment in our industry is at least 7 years. Renewal of AGOA within this year, for a minimum of 10 to 20 years, would provide the sort of comfort that companies require before investing to maximize AGOA's impact. We'd also like to highlight the continued importance of the third country fabric provision in any AGOA renewal. There are hundreds of different fabrics that will ultimately need to be produced in Africa for the continent to no longer be reliant on imported textiles. It will likely take decades for the necessary fabric mills to reach a scale where the continent will be self-sufficient. As such, the third country fabric provision will remain an essential clause in AGOA for at least the full term of any renewal. We started DTRT in 2014 when we knew AGOA was up for renewal just 1 year later, based on nothing more than faith that Congress would do the right thing and extend this important policy. We borrowed money from our friends and families, and we spent many years worrying about how we would make payroll at the end of the month. We expect to continue our rapid growth in the years to come. We believe we've played a key role in establishing West Africa as a viable manufacturing source for American apparel companies at a moment when, for the first time ever, the entire industry is seeking alternatives to China. Congress can send a strong message to ensure AGOA fulfills its promise by renewing AGOA swiftly for another term. As I tell my own team regularly, don't let perfect be the enemy of good. Yes, AGOA can be improved, but delaying its renewal risks doing more harm to the momentum we're seeing than the potential good that added refinements might offer. I implore you as a citizen, taxpayer, and entrepreneur to find a way to renew AGOA quickly, and if needed as is, with the ability to refine it in the future if necessary. Please don't let the debate on improvements to AGOA be endless, and please remember that each passing day without renewal means delaying and possibly losing forever a significant amount of business for the continent of Africa to other parts of the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Richmond. Mr. Runde, you're recognized.
Thank you. Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Blumenauer, and members of the subcommittee, thank you. There are three basic options for AGOA, which include no AGOA renewal, a copy-paste renewal of the 2015 legislation, or three, enhancing AGOA with a series of modernizations. I have two bottom lines. First, I'm in favor of renewing AGOA with some updates to the legislation. Second, and this is very important, failure to renew AGOA would be a strategic disaster for the United States. Champagne corks will pop in Beijing over our failure to renew AGOA. Our African partners will be enormously disappointed with us, and failure to pass AGOA means that American business will be disadvantaged in Africa. AGOA is a unilateral trade agreement that provides duty-free access to the U.S. market. You're all aware of that. Like the rest of the world, Africa today is a different place than the Africa of 2000. Africa is a freer place than in, say, 1990. Africa's middle class has tripled to over 350 million people. There are more smartphones in Africa than in the United States of America. The creation of the African Continental Free Trade Area, one of the largest free trade areas in the world, is a game changer. Linked with AGOA, AFCTA will encourage greater U.S. commercial investment in the African region because U.S. companies will be able to tap into suppliers across the continent. China's engagement with African countries has dramatically increased in the past decade. 52 of the 54 African countries have signed on to the Belt and Road. China has invested at least 2.5 times as much in African infrastructure as the entire Western world. The Chinese have ownership of 23 ports or control of 23 ports in Africa. China is consolidating global influence over mining, including in Africa. Today, Huawei owns up to 70% of all 4G networks in Sub-Saharan Africa. U.S. trade with African states is 1/5 the size of China-African trade. AGOA is part of our offer to Africa to counter China. So I've got several recommendations. First, renew AGOA, please, and make some improvements. There's some special considerations for the digital space and for minerals. Although there are no barriers to African digital trade exports to the United States, Congress has an opportunity to recognize the growing importance of digital trade. Language can be included in AGOA's reauthorization to develop a partnership, a digital partnership with Africa that builds on emerging international standards and reduces barriers to digital trade in African countries. Right now, there are no countries in Africa currently making electric vehicles or electric batteries. And there are no tariffs on basic raw materials and minerals. So, however, now would be the time for us to ramp up our partnership with African countries through the Minerals Strategic Partnership. Regardless of whether or not Congress determines if AGOA eligibility is the equivalent of an FTA for the purposes of the Inflation Reduction Act, the U.S. should launch a comprehensive development and development finance initiative along the lines of Power Africa for mining and minerals in Africa. Number 3, fix graduation eligibility. Renewal should fix graduation criteria so that countries that benefit from AGOA are not punished for their success by being graduated out of the program. Becoming a middle-income country like Mauritius means that these countries graduate from AGOA and these countries lose their AGOA benefits. 4, we should create bilateral free trade agreements on the African continent. We should think about regional free trade agreements along the lines of the CAFTA-DR agreement in Latin America for West, East, and Southern Africa. 5th, we should adjust the timelines. Let's aim for at least a 10-year or even a 16-year renewal. 6, let's use foreign aid to support AGOA. In the next Congress, I hope we will develop a major foreign assistance initiative for mining and minerals. I hope we'll develop a major foreign assistance initiative to close the digital divide. And 3, I hope we develop a major foreign assistance and partnership initiative to create 20 to 30 private universities in Africa, as we did in India and Costa Rica in the 1960s. 7, the executive branch needs more than a binary on-off switch for AGOA. I know that South Africa is on your minds, and AGOA is a trade mechanism. It's not a political mechanism. When the United States experiences tensions or disagreements with certain African countries, it is tempting to treat AGOA as a stick. South Africa has been a particularly poor partner to the United States on a number of fronts, so I understand the temptation. We should instead employ a variety of political tools. The Coons-Risch draft legislation would provide a larger menu of enforcement options, including formal warnings, probationary periods, and partial termination of benefits for certain products. Finally, beyond AGOA, we need a 21st century partnership for Africa, a 21st century partnership for Africa. We first need to pass AGOA, and then we need to come to a bipartisan consensus on a strategy for a 21st century U.S.-Africa partnership, a strategy spanning trade deals, investment, capacity building, and integration of new digital realities. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Rundy. Now I recognize Mr. Nasser. Please begin.
Good afternoon, Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Blumenauer, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for holding this hearing and the opportunity to testify on the importance of these trade preference programs. My name is Af Nasser, and I am the Vice President of Sourcing, Center of Excellence, and Supplier Diversity for the Cintas Corporation. Cintas helps more than 1 million businesses of all types and sizes get ready to open their doors with confidence by providing a wide range of products, including uniforms, mats, mops, restroom supplies, first aid and safety products, fire extinguishers and testing, and safety training. Cintas's operations and facilities touch almost every corner of the United States, and our employee partners are a driving force behind our shared accomplishments. Cintas employs approximately 45,000 individuals in our workforce today. Before discussing our international supply chain, I'd like to spend a moment highlighting our diverse supply chain here in the United States. In fiscal year 2024, Cintas spent more than $320 million with certified diverse suppliers, which we define as a company that is headquartered in the United States or its territories and is owned, operated, and controlled by a U.S. citizen who's a minority, woman, or veteran. On a daily basis, I work closely with our global suppliers to ensure they conduct business in the same ethical and moral standard that we do as a company. Each and every supplier must comply with the Vendor Code of Conduct as a condition of doing business with Cintas. In addition to sourcing from more than 23 countries, Cintas operates 4 manufacturing facilities that provide for our standard uniform needs. Currently, we procure goods and products from a global network of international vendors, including Haiti, Kenya, Ethiopia, and Madagascar, which are being discussed here today. Renewal of the African Growth Opportunity Act and the Haitian Hemispheric Opportunity through Partnership Encouragement Act and the Haiti Economic Lift Program Act in advance of next year's expiration is critical to the continued success of Cintas. We strongly support the committee's efforts to reauthorize these trade preference programs and reduce trade barriers wherever possible. As we look to diversify our supply chain and minimize imports from China, Cintas's ongoing investment in Africa is critical. For this to be successful, preferences which enable us to source from markets on the continent are essential. I'd like to spend a few moments highlighting a couple of countries, starting with my mother's home country of Kenya. Kenya is a small but important supplier of apparel to the U.S. market and to Cintas. In 2023, U.S. apparel imports from Kenya were $488 million, accounting for just over 0.5% of total apparel imports. Cintas's apparel imports from Kenya accounted for approximately 5% of our total imports. Long-term renewal of AGOA would provide increased certainty for production and, as a result, potentially open increased opportunities in Kenya. Regardless of the legislative vehicle, we urge the committee to take a close look at the rules of origin to ensure they remain intact or ideally enhanced so that Kenya's apparel industry can not only remain competitive but also expand. I'd also like to thank the committee, and specifically Congressman Winstrup and many others on this dais today, for their work around the reauthorization of Hope Help Act. Renewal of these programs will provide economic hope to Haiti as it struggles through its current political and security challenges. Haiti is an integral part of our Western Hemispheric supply chain. We first began producing in Haiti in 2002 and have greatly expanded our manufacturing footprint there over the last 20 years. Today, we indirectly employ approximately 4,000 Haitians through our dedicated supplier relationships. Our suppliers' large and dedicated labor pool also set the industry standard. For example, our primary Haitian supplier operates in clean and safe environments. A nutritious lunch and chilled water are available to all the employees. Once a week, a licensed physician from Port-au-Prince visits the plants to address any health concerns that employees may have. Even with these worker benefits, our Haitian supplier remains the most highly productive and cost-competitive source that we have globally. Currently, a significant portion of apparel production originates on Haitian soil. Unfortunately, the latest security challenges and unrest in the country have significantly hindered our ability to ship to the United States. We are cautiously optimistic that Kenya's commitment to assist the Haitians will be instrumental in allowing a return to normalcy for its citizens, the Port-au-Prince region, and the country. In closing, reauthorization of these critical trade preference programs will help reinforce the United States' commitment to develop in Africa, Haiti, and beyond. Thank you again to the committee for the opportunity to testify, and I look forward to any questions you have at the appropriate time.
Thank you, Mr. Nasser. Ms. Mojica, you recognize.
Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Blumenauer, and the distinguished members of the Committee Ways and Means Subcommittee on Trade, thank you for holding this hearing and for the opportunity to testify. I represent the Solidarity Center, the largest US-based international worker rights organization, with programs in approximately 70 countries, including 20 African countries and Haiti. We partner with unions and other labor organizations to help workers attain dignity on the job, justice in their communities, and greater equity in the global economy. Today, I'll highlight working conditions in Africa and Haiti, including examples of what unions are doing to promote worker rights in Kenya and Lesotho. I will then conclude with recommendations. The need to safeguard labor rights in Africa has never been greater. Africa has the fastest growing, youngest population of any continent and will be home to a quarter of the world's workforce by 2050. Annually, between 8 million and 11 million young people enter the African labor market without a guarantee that they will find work, let alone decent jobs. The labor market in Africa is characterized by a wide income disparity between a small number of formal public and private employees and a vast informal economy. In Africa, 87% of the workforce is informal. Jobs in the informal economy have the potential to provide productive economic activity for a growing demographic, but the sector remains highly unregulated with insufficient legal protections for informal economy workers and notable violations of their rights. In Kenya, 3 trade unions representing Kenya's formal sector workers in food, health, education, and metals signed MOUs with informal worker associations in their respective sectors. This means that Kenya's trade unions have brought informal sector workers under the union umbrella. For the first time, this gives them access to legal frameworks that protects formal workers. According to the International Trade Union Confederation's Global Rights Index, 84% of countries in Africa denied workers access to justice. 40% arrested and detained workers. 93% violated the right to collective bargaining, while workers in 1 out of 5 African countries experienced violence. For example, we lost a prominent human rights lawyer and trade unionist, Tulani Maseko, to violence, a devastating loss for workers across Africa. Despite the challenges facing workers in Africa, we have witnessed some progress. In Lesotho, 3 leading apparel brands and a major supplier of denim signed binding agreements with a coalition of labor unions and women's rights organizations. Together, they are addressing and preventing gender-based violence and harassment in garment factories through mandatory education and awareness trainings and the establishment of an independent reporting and monitoring system with remedies, including termination for abusive behavior. The Solidarity Center is proud to have helped negotiate these agreements and to implement ongoing trainings for thousands of workers and managers. The progress we see in Africa is eclipsed by the turmoil and lawlessness in Haiti, where the fragile climate has left garment workers unemployed and living in extreme precarity. Existing institutions have limited capacity to hold employers accountable for non-compliance with labor law. This has been a long-standing challenge for Haitian workers, a topic detailed in Solidarity Center's 2020 testimony before this subcommittee covering consideration for the renewal of the Caribbean Basin Trade Partnership Act. Despite the present insecurity in Haiti, our experience implementing programs tells us that there will be a high risk of labor rights violations after the crisis abates. For that reason, it's critical that the U.S. pursues a worker-centric trade policy that advances sustainable economic development and protects labor and promotes labor rights. In Haiti, it should mean that regional supply chains produce and rely on decent jobs, and employers and policymakers are held to account when they break the rules. To achieve a worker-centric approach to trade, we have several recommendations. One, trade unions and worker organizations must be fully included in all phases of negotiations through the design and implementation of trade policies and initiatives. Two, the U.S. must prioritize worker-centered trade policies, leveraging trade and trade preference programs to achieve enforcement of labor laws and to compel the establishment of binding mechanisms that meaningfully address rights violations. Three, U.S. development assistance policy should support the role of trade unions in advocating for labor rights in the context of trade, including with USAID missions. And lastly, the U.S. government should prioritize and promote long-term stability in Haiti as a means to ensure economic recovery, a prerequisite for upholding labor rights. Thank you for the opportunity to share Solidarity Center's perspective. The Solidarity Center remains committed to centering workers in trade policy and leveraging trade to advance labor rights. We appreciate the work of this subcommittee to uplift the voices of workers and unions worldwide. I look forward to your question.
Thank you, Ms. Mujica. I now recognize Mr. Buchanan from Florida for his question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank all of our witnesses. It's good timing for us. Lead a delegation of Africa next week, or this Friday, actually. So we're very excited about that, and these issues will be at the top of the burner, so to speak. I did want to go back, look at the big picture, Mr. Rundy. You said that 1/5 is what, in terms of trade that we do, compare the Chinese with Africa. 282 billion the Chinese do, my numbers, 84 billion that we do. How do we close the gap? We say we need a new agreement, but we need a new and an improved agreement that helps these folks, a billion of them, in Africa, because obviously I think it's a new frontier, as you can see Mr. Richmond's story, and we really need to up our game. We talk a good game, but we don't deliver, and there's a lot of us in that. But don't sugarcoat it. Tell us how you really feel.
Okay, I'll try. Thank you. Thank you, Congressman. So I think we have not updated our cassette tape on Africa. Africa suffers from a negative media coverage. There have been studies in the New York Times and others. It's just all negative. And so we've failed to see Africa as an opportunity. The Chinese Communist Party sees Africa as a win-win opportunity. We, unfortunately, much of our partnership with Africa to date has been oriented around foreign assistance. I'm all in favor of foreign assistance. I worked at AID. I wrote a book on American soft power. I'm all for that. That has got to be one piece of a much bigger conversation. So we need an updated partnership. Getting AGOA passed, if we don't reauthorize, I think I made it clear that not reauthorizing AGOA there'll be a party in Moscow, there'll be a party in Beijing if we don't reauthorize it. So first we got to do that. I'd like to see some updates. Then I think we need to think about a more ambitious trade agenda for Africa. I think it's fantastic that you and Chairman Smith are leading these delegations to Africa. I think it's very, very important. I think we need to see Africa as a win-win partnership. They have other partners today. In the year 2000, when AGOA was started, I don't believe China was the #1 trading partner for any country in Sub-Saharan Africa. Maybe, I don't know if it's 35, I don't know if it's 40, someone can tell me, but it's going to be a lot.
I only got 5 minutes, so I want to ask. Mr. Richmond, let me ask you, one of the big advantages a lot of the Asian countries have had is basically free labor or very low-cost labor. How does that equate in Africa? Because does that make some sense there? Or what happens with the labor component in Africa? Because that's obviously, maybe they're making 3 times what they made, but you're able to get a lot more competitive. But in a sense, it also hurts indirectly. It might hurt the U.S. But what's your thoughts?
The cost of of labor and what people are making in China and Asia, you know, it's gone up a lot in recent years. You know, my view on that is that actually the money that we pay, and I, you know, heard the comments the gentleman from Cintas made. I mean, we're paying our lowest paid workers making, you know, like well more, like double of what the country's minimum wage is. You know, we offer a free catered lunch every day, free transportation, all of those things. It's meaningful. The labor cost in China and in Asia has gone up, but they are far more efficient and they're far more experienced. They've been doing this for, you know, decades. And the labor force in Ghana and most African countries need that training. They need those skills.
Thank you. Mr. Nasser, let me ask you, did you say you were born in Kenya?
My mom was born in Kenya. My dad was born in Tanzania.
Okay, well, that's one of the areas we've been talking about for like 4 or 5 years, about a free trade agreement. That's something that clearly needs to get done. The momentum should start there. And the crazy thing is, I think it's very, very bipartisan. I can't understand why we can't be serious and get that done in a way, because that's part of the reason we're losing. As a guy that's been in business for a long time, when I got a sense of a good acquisition, I went and closed it. And we need to close the deal with that. What's your thoughts, quickly?
I think that there's a lot of opportunities in Africa. The institutions that we have there are very flexible and very adaptable. I think the biggest challenge for us when you think about the logistics of Africa is the lead times and the transportation and the carrying costs associated with that long duration. We look for business continuity and business resiliency, and we like to make sure that we're diverse. There's a lot of diversification, but I think we need to have a structure in place in Africa that makes it more palatable from an investment perspective and from a timing perspective to make sure that we invest more in Africa.
Quickly, Mr. Rundy, did you have anything you wanted to add in terms of free trade agreement there?
We should absolutely begin negotiations for a free trade agreement with Kenya.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, and I recognize Ranking Member Blumenauer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for being here. Ms. Mujica, you have a fascinating background in some of the more complex countries in this area. You point out in your testimony both Haiti and Sub-Saharan Africa struggle with high levels of informal employment. This increasing casualization of work can lead to rampant labor abuses and precarious income. Given the low level of government capacity and the highly informal nature of work across Africa, how can we best ensure that trade is a force for good that helps protect workers' rights and lift livelihood? I appreciate your focus on a worker-centered trade policy, and I wonder if you could elaborate on this.
Thank you for that important question. There are several ways that the United States government should leverage trade policy and other laws to improve conditions of work for workers in the informal sector. One of the most important approaches is improving conditions for workers in the informal sector is to include them as stakeholders in discussions and negotiations about the development and implementation of any trade policies. Their voices are essential to having a worker-centered approach to trade. The U.S. government should continue to invest in foreign assistance that strengthens government institutions and enables civil society to exercise fundamental labor rights. Technical assistance is vital to ensure that governments develop labor inspectorate regimes that establish effective social protection schemes for workers and that engage in labor diplomacy. All this to say that workers must be put at the center of any conversation on trade. Thank you.
Thank you. Any observations from your perspective about what we should be doing in Haiti, given the chaotic situation that's there, the long-term consequences of the United States failures? Do any of you have some perspective on what we should be doing in that regard? Mr. Rooney?
Thank you, Congressman. I really hope that we can renew the Haiti Help Act this year. The best social program in the world is a job. Companies are already leaving as we speak. I really hope that the Congress can coalesce around one bill. I hope let not the perfect be the enemy of the good on the Haiti Help Act.
Further observations? Mr. Nasser?
Yeah, I think the extension of Haiti help for additional 10 years is welcome, but it would be ideal if Congress at some point can consider something more permanent for us to establish more predictability in that region.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Blumenauer. And now recognize Mr. Hood from Illinois.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank the witnesses for your valuable testimony here today and adding to this conversation. I'm really pleased that we're holding this hearing today regarding trade preference programs that, of course, are due to lapse in 2025, including AGOA and certain programs for imports from Haiti. Trade preference programs like AGOA and GSP serve as important mechanisms for the U.S. to encourage global economic growth and promote American goodwill and trade priorities abroad. We've heard a little bit this morning, obviously, about the competition that we have with China and Russia and other adversaries, particularly in Africa. I also serve on our Select Committee on China and also on the Intelligence Committee. And as we think about how do we win the strategic competition against the CCP in China, particularly in Africa, I think you do that on the economic front. So things like AGOA, things like engagement need to be there. And I would say, as we compete against Belt and Road and a number of other initiatives from our adversaries, we need to highlight that what we focus and predicate our policies on are competition, the rule of law, enforcement mechanisms, things that work. Sometimes it's very hard to compete against China and Russia and others because they don't play by the same sets of rules and standards that every other industrialized country in the world does. And that puts us at a disadvantage. So I just want to mention that as we think about how do we compete in this space. I also just want to acknowledge Trade Committee Chairman Adrian Smith for his leadership in advancing the renewal of these programs, particularly this bill to renew and update GSP, which was advanced out of the Ways and Means Committee in April. And I am committed to working with you, Chairman Smith, and our colleagues on the committee to get this legislation across the finish line. It's vitally important when we think about our economic diplomacy around the globe. In my view, it is crucial that the United States continue these programs as an effective countermeasure to the CCP in their efforts to replace the United States as a global economic leader. I will also mention I serve as the co-chair of the Digital Trade Caucus, and I've been especially concerned about China's digital trade and domestic regulatory laws that promote surveillance, allow for worker and human rights violations, and run counter to our American ideals. Moreover, China is now exporting these principles through targeted initiatives like the Digital Silk Road, which is a series of developmental projects intended to build up countries' telecommunication networks, AI capabilities, e-commerce, and mobile payment systems and surveillance technologies. They are rampant throughout much of Africa and other third world countries. It's my view that the United States needs to promote a strong agenda when it comes to digital trade and explore ways to modernize our trade programs, bringing them into the 21st century. Mr. Rundy, I'm going to start with you. In your written testimony, you highlight that the U.S. has failed to recognize Africa's growing digital economy, opening the door for China to capitalize on our absent guidance there. In your opinion, how can the United States regain its leadership in this space, and what steps can we make to ensure that we do not get it in our own way again?
Thank you, Congressman. We can't fight something with nothing, and so we need to have a new digital partnership with China. We ought to be investing in training and capacity building in Africa around digital issues. We should be supporting ICT policy development. We should also be incentivizing rip and replace. 70% of 4G in Africa is Huawei. We do not want the digital rails of the future of Africa controlled by the unholy trinity of Huawei, Alipay, and ZTE.
Thank you for that. With my remaining time, Mr. Rundy, could you elaborate on what changes you think could be made to AGOA to better develop commercial partnerships and facilitate a digital trade more effectively? If you can comment on that, and then I have a follow-up.
Yeah, so I suggest in my testimony that language could be included to develop a partnership around emerging international standards and reducing barriers to digital trade in Africa, including cross-border data flows and internet access. I think we ought to be thinking about using our foreign assistance and the DFC and the Exim Bank as wraparounds to AGOA, and I think there could be language in the in the legislation that reflects that.
And as we think about that, if you look at the digital chapters that we put into USMCA as kind of a benchmark and a model, I mean, is that what we ought to be looking at in terms of a bilateral digital trade agreement with countries like Kenya and others?
Yes. I think we should have a Kenya free trade agreement, and we should begin negotiations as soon as possible. And I'd like to also see, yes, I'd like to see, I think we should be working toward, I think the USMCA digital chapter is what we should be working towards.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Hood. I now recognize Mr. Kilby from Michigan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Ranking Member Blumenauer also for holding this really important hearing. And I agree with much of the sentiment that's been expressed, most particularly, Mr. Runde, you made the point that the U.S. presence is not nearly adequate for us to have any of our values manifest in the relationship that we have, nor any of our values manifest for the people of the African continent. It makes a difference where the investment comes from and where the relationships are built. And if we defer to our adversaries, we have no ability really to have a meaningful impact on the continent. I will be joining Mr. Buchanan on this delegation next week, so I very much look forward to exploring these issues much further. And I also agree that reauthorization of AGOA with, I think, significant improvements is absolutely necessary for us to achieve the goals that we've been addressing. And I think in particular, it would be a mistake for us to reauthorize without using the opportunity to elevate these relationships. Specifically, and this has been referenced, in the area of worker rights, where the USMCA example, I think, is actually a pretty good one. Not only do we have pretty significant provisions, but also an enforcement mechanism built in and some prerequisites, some pre-requirements in order for the benefits to go into effect. I'm curious, and I wonder if I could start with Ms. Mahike, if you could talk a little bit about some of the implementation strategies. I mean, it's already embedded in AGOA that there's a requirement to comply with internationally recognized worker rights provisions. But if you could address how these national action plans on business and human rights in several African countries, particularly Kenya, are being used to pursue implementation of what we already have agreed to pursue.
Thank you. I think it's still early to assess the impact of national action plans on business and human rights. For example, as you've stated, Kenya adopted its first NAPs in 2019, while Uganda in 2021. And several other countries are in the process of developing their own national action plans. The United States can support trade unions and workers to participate in the development of these plans in their countries alongside other stakeholders from civil society organizations.
Thank you. I know it has been mentioned specifically regarding Kenya that the administration is pursuing an executive level agreement. I agree with some of my colleagues that we ought to be pursuing a full bilateral trade agreement that has all of the necessary mechanisms for enforcement and implementation. But I wonder, Ms. Mahike, if you could comment specifically. I've been concerned that earlier this year, members of the Kenya Medical Practitioners, Pharmacists, and Dentists Union, including the General Secretary of that organization, were reportedly attacked for peaceably protesting some differences that they have with Kenya's healthcare system. What can we do, what can the U.S. do to prevent those sorts of practices, those sorts of attacks, including specific attacks on labor leaders, which has a chilling effect on the advocacy on behalf of workers?
Thank you for that important question. I'm a Kenyan citizen, and I only moved here to Washington, D.C. last 6 months. So I totally understand your concern. And as it regards to the Kenyan doctors, where we saw a blatant attack on Kenya's Secretary General of the Kenya Medical Practitioners and Dentists Union, Dr. Davji, and I must say that he's a personal friend of mine. Before I took on my current role, I was the country program director for the Solidarity Center based in Nairobi, so I did work alongside the Doctors Union in Kenya, and many other unions for about 4 or 5 years. I believe that the United States government can play a critical role in preventing such attacks on workers and on labor leaders. First, the US government must continue to support mechanisms that provide resources to human rights defenders under threat or in exile. In moments of acute crisis, we know our partners rely on our support from the United States to enable them to access legal representation, relocation assistance, and medical services. Second, labor leaders under threat benefit from the United States public support. When senior United States government officials meet with workers and labor leaders, when ambassadors invite labor leaders to United States embassies, when elected representatives take time to connect with workers during overseas travel, like what you're doing next week, and as you've thoughtfully done in many occasions, it affords them a profile that offers protection, and it makes a difference to the workers personally. And I'll conclude my interventions there. Thank you.
I appreciate it. I wish I had more time because I'd love to hear from the other panels. Maybe some of you can comment as we pursue this. And finally, before we depart for this delegation, if any of you have specific issues that you'd like us to raise in the various places we'll be visiting, please reach out to our offices. I'd appreciate it very much. Thank you.
What countries are you visiting?
Kenya, Tanzania, the Gambia, and Cabo Verde.
All right, thank you. Next, I recognize Mr. Estes from Kansas.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to all our witnesses for being here today. You know, as a representative of Kansas' 4th Congressional District, I'm honored to represent many farmers and ranchers in Kansas. You know, agriculture is a major economic industry in my home state. Kansas is #1 producer of wheat and sorghum and #3 producer in cattle and beef processor in the United States. Agriculture trade is a key way the Sunflower State connects with the rest of the world, including Sub-Saharan Africa. In fact, in 2023, Kansas exported goods valued at $294 million to Sub-Saharan Africa. Last fall, I visited Ethiopia and Rwanda to engage in and advance discussions on trade with the United States, among several other items. And Kansas wheat farmers recently returned from a trade mission to Sub-Saharan Africa, where they were seeking to bolster the relationship between the United States and the region in hopes of strengthening and expanding access to the international markets. Kansas ag producers benefit from open markets and free and fair trade, and hopefully renewal of the African Growth and Opportunity Act, AGOA, will help expand market access. It's crucial that we have these conversations now so that we can renew AGOA before it lapses next September. Mr. Rundy, in renewing AGOA, how can we assure fair market access commitments for U.S. agricultural products?
Thank you, Congressman. I do think that a couple of things. There's been some issues around pork and chicken, in particular in certain countries in Africa, and specifically South Africa. I know a number of pork producers have expressed concern about that. AGOA has the ability to resolve, it has in it the resolution of bilateral trade disputes as one of the reasons by which they qualify for AGOA benefits. So if we have bilateral trade disputes in agriculture, we ought to be using AGOA qualification as saying, hey, you know, if you want to qualify, let's try and work this out. I also think it certainly seems to me that AGOA has provisions that to require that barriers to U.S. exports are eliminated, including unjustified sanitary and phytosanitary barriers. I also think that if those don't work, we ought to think about WTO formal complaints, specifically in the case of, say, South Africa. And then finally, I've heard some good things about supporting more support for some of the USDA agricultural export promotion programs. So I think all of those things would be things I would consider, Congressman.
Yep. Well, thank you. And obviously, one of the key goals we have with AGOA is how do we move the AGOA countries from the preferential program to, quote unquote, graduate and be part of stronger reciprocal trade agreements. How are countries ready to make this jump, and how can we get more countries to do that?
Thank you, Congressman. I think that we need to fix the concept of graduation. In my testimony, I said countries like Mauritius are now middle-income countries, and you basically graduate to nothing, which is terrible. When this was originally envisioned 25 years ago, the idea was this was a halfway house until we could develop free trade agreements with bilateral countries or with regions the way we have with CAFTA DR in Latin America. I would hope, as I said in my testimony, that we would begin again to have bilateral free trade agreements in Africa. I think we should begin free trade agreement negotiations with Kenya immediately, and I also think we should be thinking about regional trade agreements with West, Southern, and East Africa. Thank you, Congressman.
Yeah, I mean, that's we kind of undercut a little bit of the value of AGOA without following up with that, those bilateral trade agreements once we're done, yeah. As I mentioned earlier, one of the countries I visited last fall was Ethiopia, whose AGOA status was terminated in 2021 due to violations stemming from a civil war in the Tigray province, or Tigray region. This is obviously jeopardized growth and investment in the region, and that followed the most recent AGOA renewal in 2015. Obviously, Ethiopia, as part of the discussions that I had there, as well as others, would like to have that reinstated and is working to address those issues. Obviously, there's lots of concerns as you have rebel activity, and that happens scattered throughout the world. Given some of the heightened risk and instability, how do we make sure that we make countries recognize the value and be more participative? So are there ways we can strengthen AGOA to help with that certainty and help make it more attractive, Mr. Runde, for other countries to participate?
So in my testimony, I talked about that we ought to be, there's some improvements. I think the Coons-Rich bill has some examples of some specific improvements around trade. I also think we ought to be looking at some specific initiatives around digital and mining, and we ought to use our foreign assistance in some ways to kind of be wraparounds to AGOA. Ethiopia is a really big country. We can't ignore it. We've often relied on it as sort of as a security partner in that part of the world, and so I'm hoping that we can get to a better place with Ethiopia at some point.
Thank you. And free and fair trade is such an important part for the world. It's lifted more people out of poverty over the last 70 years, and we want to continue to have that.
Trade in the private sector are what lift people out of poverty, but foreign aid is a supporting actor in this, but the real actor is the private sector.
Right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Estes. I now recognize Mr. Panetta from California.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And gentlemen, ma'am, thank you for being here. Obviously, I'm on the Ways and Means Committee, but I'm also on the Armed Services Committee. So obviously, trade's important, but security is important as well. And I haven't heard too much testimony about that today, and so I'm going to talk about that a little bit. And yes, Mr. Runn, thanks for the thumbs up, because you got my first question. But before I get there, look, I think obviously we know, and as you've said, the 2025 expiration of AGOA comes as we begin an exit, though, from Niger and potentially Chad, at least militarily, in our U.S. forces. And we're seeing a deteriorating security environment all across the Sahel, an area that I have had help in calling a déjà vu of an area. That's what we're seeing. So I do believe it is critical to understand how offering market access to others in the region allows the U.S. to improve the livelihoods and create favorable conditions for new security partnerships. Access to U.S. markets is a tool that we can and should wield to advance development while supporting the ability of our African partners to hedge against security threats, including political instability and, yes, VEO's violent extremism. I have been an advocate for more U.S. attention to the economy and security of Sub-Saharan Africa, as I mentioned, especially based on the committees that I'm on. Some of the fastest growing economies in the world, as you've talked about, are located on the continent, and those same states are challenged, though, with porous borders, very weak governance, surges in violent extremist organizations, and an increased presence, not just from China, but Russia, as you mentioned well, Mr. Rund. But securing the Sahel requires more than providing conventional military support. I think we can all agree with that. And so we must support robust economies amongst our African partners to support good governance, prevent economic exploitation that threatens regional security, and enables greater influence from terrorist and extremist organizations. That said, I'm curious to see how we can improve AGOA and similar programs, and I hope to hear more about how to expand upon these programs' successes and modernize them to reflect the changed security and economic realities. So, Mr. Rund, as you've heard and as you know, we got a military withdrawal from Chad. a military withdrawal from Niger. We saw it in Mali. We saw it in Burkina Faso. And we've seen a void that's been created and obviously being filled by our near peers, competition. And those types of voids, they significantly impact our counterterrorism efforts and regional surveillance capabilities as well in that area. As U.S. AFRICOM and the Department of Defense consider new security partnerships, which will be interesting to see how that develops, to backfill these strategic locations, we're also hearing concerns that some of these states may succumb to democratic backsliding, like we've seen pretty much all across the Sahel, as I mentioned. That said, you talked about improvements to AGOA. Let me ask you, do you think one of the improvements we could amend AGOA could be to enhance capability building assistance and instill good governance?
Thanks. The bad guys can fill voids today. So they're a near-peer soft power competitor, not just a near-peer hard power competitor. China and Russia. So China is selling security for diamonds and gas, basically. Africa's going to go from 1.1 billion to something like 2.5 billion people. There'll be more African citizens than citizens of China and India in 25 years. There's a whole series of, we're going to need hundreds of millions of jobs. Either we're going to have a demographic dividend in Africa or we're going to have something else. I want a demographic dividend. So absolutely, I think AGOA is one of the pillars of our partnership. We need a whole series of other things as wraparound. So I agree with you, Congressman, the sorts of things that you're talking about. But I do think dictatorships partner with dictatorships. Yeah. So the more members of the Star Wars bar of thug regimes, they're going to partner up with Russia and China. And so I think we should want to enable better democratic governance, not just because it's the right thing to do, but oftentimes democracies, there was a book written many years ago called The Democracy Advantage about how democracies ultimately over the long term have better economic performance. So it's in our interest. We don't want these countries making nice with China because they're going to have these ports. There's more than 20 ports basically controlled by China, and 70% of the digital rails of the future of Africa are controlled by Huawei. It's not a great situation for us, sir.
Exactly. So it's sort of China's bringing the economic investment, Russia's bringing the security investment, and that puts us on the sidelines.
Right, and so to the extent that we step back, they can fill voids. This isn't 1995 anymore, whether in the Taiwan Strait or in the Sahel.
Exactly. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks to all of you. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Panetta. I now recognize Ms. Miller from West Virginia.
Thank you, Chairman Smith and Ranking Member Blumenauer, who I think is still here. Thank you all for being here today. The AGOA program has proven invaluable for economic growth of sub-Saharan countries, empowering African women and increased opportunities for American producers. And it is vital that Congress commits to renewing and strengthening AGOA as soon as possible. As we begin negotiations for AGOA, it is equally important that we consider the broader goals of strengthening bilateral ties with countries around the world to counter China's malign influence. This committee has made great strides to do so through marking up critical legislation to reauthorize GSP, but we can still do better. It's imperative that we remain optimistic towards enacting free trade agreements with our allies, particularly Ecuador, as we work to renew GSP, AGOA, and the other crucial programs that we are discussing today. One important provision of both AGOA and the Haiti Hope Act is the inclusion of apparel as an eligible product. Under AGOA, U.S. imports of apparel rose from $696 million in 2000 to $1.4 billion in 2021. In Haiti, apparel industry exports account for nearly 90% of total exports. Importantly, Haitians have shown resilience despite the unrest in their country and are still showing up to work. Mr. Richmond, as an employer of 5,000 workers in a developing country, how have you witnessed the apparel industry lift citizens out of poverty, and what more can Congress do to help the growth of this industry?
Thank you. We've witnessed great things, and that's exactly why we started our business, is that we recognize the power for good that the apparel industry has. Again, everyone we hire right? All 5,600, okay, maybe not all, maybe 5,500 because some of those are accountants with specialized training. But the real factory workers, they have no experience. There's no educational requirement, right? Everyone comes in. Most of them have never had a formal job. Many don't have a bank account, right? So we hire them, we train them, they get opportunity, right? They have bank accounts, they're part of the Social Security program now with the government, right? They pay taxes, all of these things that make them productive, right? And they do make a wage that not only they can live on, but we have countless stories of women who joined us at one level and then have been promoted to supervisory or management positions and now are paying for their siblings or others to go to school and those sorts of things. Be happy to send, separately countless stories of those that we have.
Well, do companies like yours need a strong sense of certainty of the American preference programs in order to commit to your investments in the region?
Absolutely. I mean, we do, and so do so many others who are, looking to grow this. Again, there's so many now brands. Everyone's looking to source from Africa, but there aren't enough qualified suppliers like ourselves. There needs to be more in order to incentivize the brands to place business there, right? And ultimately,
yeah,
sorry.
It's okay. Mr. Rundi. Another area of particular concern for me is our reliance on China and Russia for critical minerals. I've introduced several pieces of legislation, including the End Chinese Dominance of Electric Vehicles in America Act, to close these loopholes and to counteract the leg up our adversaries have in this sector. I appreciated hearing from you that Africa houses substantial critical mineral deposits. How could inclusion of critical minerals in AGOA benefit American producers and consumers?
Thank you, Congresswoman, and thank you for your leadership on the Ecuador caucus as well. Look, if we're going to have a carbon transition, we better love mining to the tips of our toes. I was at AID for a long time, and I like AID a lot, and I was in the international development business, and I worked at the World Bank Group. But asking my friends in the international development community to work on mining projects, they'd rather get a root canal than work on mining projects. Most people don't want to work on mining projects. We need to spend a lot more foreign aid on minerals and mining. We need to make sure it's clean, that there's fair money, that people are getting a fair share of the resources, and that the people are treated well labor-wise.
Okay, quickly.
Yep. So
I want to ask you about the Chinese trade agreements in South America
Yeah.
and what an individual preference program for a country like Ecuador could mean for competing in the region and the possibility of a full free trade agreement.
we absolutely should have a free trade agreement with Ecuador. I think the IDEA Act is okay, but I think China has a free trade agreement with Ecuador. It's a lost opportunity for us. So if they are to join the Caribbean Basin Initiative, I think it's okay. I'm in agreement that we should have a free trade agreement with Ecuador as soon as possible. We have a pro-American president. There's going to be an election in Ecuador soon. They've been knocking on our door for a while. We ought to show up for our friends.
Thank you so much. I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Miller. And I now recognize Ms. Del Bene from Washington State.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and to Ranking Member Blumenauer for holding this important meeting, and thank you to all of our witnesses for joining us and taking the time today. Like many of my colleagues, I believe that AGOA is a critical tool in the American foreign policy arsenal to promote development and create jobs in sub-Saharan Africa. It's also led to jobs and economic growth in Washington State. We are one of the most trade-dependent states in the country, and my friend and former colleague, Washington State Congressman Jim McDermott, was one of the original authors of AGOA back in the early 2000s. So while AGOA has been transformational for certain African economies and certain sectors, there's so much more the U.S. should be doing to meet the economic needs on the continent. And if we succeed, American workers and our economic security and theirs will be better off also. I know you were in mid-discussion on this, Mr. Rundy. In your testimony, you recommend that Congress modernize AGOA by focusing on Africa's digital economy and as well as critical minerals. I wanted to see if you could say a little bit more and discuss the benefits and challenges of allowing AGOA beneficiary countries, perhaps those that meet certain heightened labor and environmental criteria, access to American tax credits for EVs, and batteries?
Thanks. I've put a lot of time into trying to understand this issue. As I understand, there are no countries in Africa today that currently make electric vehicles nor make electric batteries. So, and there are no tariffs on basic raw materials and minerals today. So I understand so I'm interested in finding ways for us to support mining and minerals in Africa. It's not, we need to be doing a lot more to, I think the minerals, the Minerals Security Partnership, I think, we should be doing a lot more in Africa around that. If we are going to have a line item in AGOA or some sort of language in AGOA specifically about for AGOA eligibility for the IRA, it's going to be for the future. As of right now, we'd have to think about 3 to 5 or 7 years from now. So I think we should be doing a lot more with the Minerals Strategic Partnership, or Security Partnership, and we should be using a lot more of our foreign assistance, both bilaterally and using the DFC. We need to be doing a lot more in flooding the zone on minerals with our soft power.
Thank you. I also wanted to ask you a little bit more, building off of Congressman LaHood's question, what we can do to help African entrepreneurs sell online, this is on the digital side, sell online, or how we can help finance Africa's broadband build out.
Thank you. I do think we need a new partnership with Africa, a new digital partnership with Africa. I think that AGOA can call for that. I think we could call for that in the legislation. I do think there's a series of things we can be doing around supporting ICT policy development, training. I also think we ought to make available money for rip and replace of Huawei. 70% of the 4G in Africa is controlled by Huawei. I mean, this is crazy. I mean, we're not going to be, this is very, very bad. So I do think that, the USMCA digital chapter, I think, is the gold standard, and all of our trade agreements in the future should work towards the USMCA digital chapter.
Or try to provide some type of digital, there's obviously doing full agreements. Folks have also looked at other ways to do digital, so.
Yeah, I would love to see us have a bilateral free trade agreement with Kenya, and I'd love us to return to seeking free trade agreements in Africa.
Are there other particular countries?
Yeah, certainly Kenya. I'd start immediately.
I think Kenya's there. I was wondering if there's anyone outside of Kenya that was.
I would think we ought to think about potentially regional trade agreements along the lines of CAFTA-DR with, say, West Africa, East Africa, and Southern Africa. That'd be the other thing I would do.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. I now recognize Mr. Arrington from Texas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Witnesses today, we appreciate your insights. I'll be taking my first Codell outside of my freshman trip to Israel to Africa this week to meet with leaders of several African nations, some of which are included in this partnership, trade partnership. I'm not a trade expert, but my understanding is that the benefit to both parties, and specifically to the United States for doing AGOA-like trade deals, is to integrate supply chains with the U.S. and not China, to provide maybe cheaper inputs for manufacturers in the U.S. with products coming from, in this case, AGOA nations, and to develop that relationship so that as it matures, as their markets and economies mature, we can have this sort of more developed and more mature bilateral and reciprocal trade relationship where we're not only giving AGOA partners access to our markets with their goods, but they are opening their markets to the U.S. equally for our goods and services. In the case of agriculture, I hail from West Texas, where we generate a lot of ag and energy product. And when I look at the data on the tariffs in Kenya on ag products like peanuts, sorghum, beef, and dairy, it's anywhere from 25% to over 50%. And those are just the tariff barriers, and there are
non-tariff barriers that I won't enumerate, and then you look at Ghana's average ag tariff, which is 17.5%, Nigeria 15.9%. Our average tariff in the United States is 5%. So at some point, this needs to be a two-way street, a mutually beneficial relationship that has matured beyond just the initial investment in AGOA. We're 25 years now into this. I don't know, it seems to me we ought to be asking the question, why hasn't it developed further? I'm all for AGOA from what I understand of it, and that there have been benefits accrued to both sides of the deal, but we're 25 years into it, and we still don't have the reciprocity and the fair access that I think we should expect as American policymakers. So I guess, Mr. Rundy, I'd ask you first, is that a fair characterization? Is that a realistic expectation 25 years later into this deal?
Thank you, Congressman. I 100% agree with you. It's been 25 years. The world has changed. Africa has changed. We have changed. There are about 450,000 U.S. jobs linked to U.S.-Africa trade, so it's not totally a one-way street. And there's something like 1.3 million African jobs linked to that's sustained by AGOA. But we have not met the full potential of AGOA by any stretch of the imagination. When it was set up, as I mentioned earlier, it was meant as sort of a halfway house for us to start building free trade partnerships with Africa. We're now starting to see several things happen in the last 25 years. Now having countries becoming middle income status, like Mauritius. They're about to given the current rules, they could graduate to nothing because we were gonna set up free trade agreements. Unfortunately, there's been a decrease in appetite and political will for us to pursue free trade agreements in the United States, and I regret that very much. So I think, and the other thing I would say that's different from 25 years ago is China is eating our lunch on the continent.
Yeah, I get that sense too. Somebody told me that in the last couple of decades, they've doubled their trade and export to the African continent. You have better data.
Yeah, so our trade with Africa is 1/5 the amount that China has with Africa.
Well, and ours is going down and theirs is going up.
Yeah.
And about the same rate.
And they're probably the #1 trading partner for several dozen African countries when it was 0 25 years ago.
We need to be a lot more aggressive, Mr. Chairman. We have to have a higher expectation from our partners, and I hope we move forward in that way. Last question, Mr. Nasser, for you. We're the largest cotton patch in the world. 1/3 of the cotton exported out of the United States comes from 100-mile radius of Lubbock, America, which is where I live. It's the largest population center in my district. And the rules of origin requirements are important in AGOA so that we're benefiting both countries, and that the textile supply chain is one that is benefiting us because it's including the AGOA nation raw cotton product and the United States. Is that being enforced? If it's not adequately being enforced, how are people taking advantage of that, and how do we ensure that those provisions, and that one in particular, are being enforced so we're benefiting both countries in the fullness of the supply chain, in cotton in particular?
Yeah, so I can't speak from a macroeconomic perspective if it's being enforced. I can tell you that we adhere to the right standards and compliances within our supply chain.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Arrington. I now recognize Ms. Sanchez from California.
Thank you. I want to thank the ranking member and the chairman for holding a hearing on this important issue. It's pretty clear that the U.S. can't simply focus on providing aid to emerging economies, whether it's Sub-Saharan Africa or Haiti, to develop. Africa features some of the world's fastest growing economies and a booming young population, which creates the perfect environment for both American and African businesses to thrive if we can get this right. U.S. investments, market access, and economic incentives can fuel job creation. It can also boost local economies and help develop new innovative industries in those emerging economies. AGOA has created a generation of young women entrepreneurs and significantly improved women labor participation rates across Africa, which is a very good thing. So Congress should not let a program like this go without being renewed, like we did with PEPFAR, because these are programs that really do create great partnerships and create good outcomes. We have to show that emerging economies that we can be a reliable economic partner, even though their economies are cyclical, they go up, they go down. People may experience turbulent economic times, but if we were to reauthorize AGOA and our trade preferences with Haiti, I think that that would garner a lot of goodwill, not to mention, as I said, the economic partnerships that can be created. Having said that, though, as many of my colleagues have said, we're all very much in favor of reauthorizing AGOA. We should take this opportunity to try to improve it, try to make some needed reforms to these programs, because just creating market access alone is not going to be enough to stimulate the economic development that we're looking to see in Africa. So I am hopeful that we can come to agreement on what we can do to update AGOA to make it a better agreement for both of us. We know that in some of the countries that we trade with, there are issues that still linger of gender-based violence, of hereditary and child slavery. We know that there are many places around the world, many partners that we trade with that continue to have issues with worker rights. And we know that this is, not unique to Africa, certainly, but we do see that there are those ongoing problems that we need to address. That's despite the fact that we do have worker rights emphasis in the AGOA eligibility criteria. In Haiti, which has been very challenging, wage theft and worker exploitation issues have really harmed the Haitian population, and that's just further aggravated the poor economic conditions in that country. As I said, we have an opportunity to do better, and I think we must do better. My first question is for Ms. Mujica. An innovative labor agreement that has emerged from the AGOA garment sector is a multi-stakeholder agreement to stop gender-based violence in Lesotho. That binding agreement is the first instance in which apparel brands and their suppliers entered into enforceable agreements with workers specifically to stop gender-based violence. In addition to expanding on the significance of that agreement, I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on how the U.S. Can use its trade policy to encourage agreements among producers, labor advocates, and civil society groups, specifically to address labor violations.
Thank you, Ms. Sanchez, for that important question. And I'd like to reiterate that the Solidarity Center is proud to have supported the agreements that you're talking about in Lesotho. I think the U.S. development assistance policy should support the role of unions in advocating for labor rights in the context of trade, and this should include the USAID missions, across the world, especially in Sub-Saharan Africa. And then lastly, the U.S. government must prioritize worker-centered trade policies, leveraging trade agreements and trade preference programs to achieve enforceable labor laws and to compel the establishment of binding mechanisms that meaningfully address rights violation. All this to say that the U.S. government has the opportunity to be a leader, to show that when you center workers in labor policies or trade policies, you are doing the right thing. Thank you.
Thank you. I have one more question. I'm almost out of time, but I would accept the answer in writing after. Mr. Runde, in your written testimony, you recommended that Congress consider including language on critical minerals in AGOA. And while I agree that the U.S. should look to new markets, I do have concerns that emerging economies that are rich in natural resources, like many of the countries in Africa, have been in the past subject to exploitation, including environmental and labor exploitation, which actually undermines their development. So my question for you, which we'll take in writing after, is how can the U.S. work with African countries, including through our development financing tools, to create vertically integrated supply chains rather than just extracting the raw resources? And I thank the chairman for his indulgence, and I yield back.
Thank you. I now recognize Mr. Smucker from Pennsylvania.
Thank you, Chairman Smith, for convening today's important hearing. I do want to echo my colleagues' calls for an on-time renewal of AGOA. It is important that we prevent any lapse in the program to give certainty to the businesses that have invested in Sub-Saharan Africa or plan to. They need to know that those incentives will remain in place. Also want to join my colleagues in expressing to the Biden administration that there's bipartisan support in Congress to deepen our trade relationship with Africa, and I urge the administration to resume dialogue on the U.S.-Kenya Free Trade Agreement. Mr. Runde, we've discussed a lot. There's been a lot of people before me here. Talked about areas of reform to strengthen the trade ties. I mean, we talked spanning from graduation policies, expanding agricultural access, reforms to grow the apparel sector. Anything else? Any other ideas that you have for reform that we should consider that haven't yet been raised today?
Yeah, so I do think certainly a 10-year renewal or a 16-year renewal, as is in the Coons-Risch bill, that's kind of mimicking the USMCA language.
This is just want the long-term predictability.
Yeah, I think that's good. I also think the current arrangement, there's like an annual review. It's pretty onerous. I think we could have, instead reviewing the eligibility every 3 years instead of every 1 year. I think that would be another simple thing we could do. So I think those are things that I also think some of the proposals for giving a broader menu for the executive branch and not just having an on-off switch, I think those are all good things, Congressman.
Okay, great. Critical mineral supply chains have been talked about, a critical issue for the country. We want to move some of that out of China. I know you've mentioned it, but like how can AGOA help with that? Like how is that important?
So, as I said, as of right now, there are no African countries making electric vehicles or making electric batteries. And there are no tariffs specifically on the raw materials themselves, or minerals. I do think, though, that we ought to be doing a lot more with Africa on minerals. There's the Mineral Security Partnership that we should be engaging a lot more aggressively in Africa. I do think that we need to be putting a lot more of our foreign assistance and development finance resources on mining and minerals. I don't think the American people are going to accept switching from the internal combustion engine to electric vehicles and batteries controlled by the People's Republic of China. It just will stop.
Thank you. Mr. Richmond, your story is really fascinating. The apparel sector represents a logical area for AGOA partners to fill in the missing pieces so that fabrics can not only be sourced domestically, but also processed and transformed to finished good, all within the African continent. From your experience operating in Africa, you've talked about this already, but what are some of the things that would continue to allow the industry to flourish? What are some of the things that have held it back from doing that at this point?
Thank you for the question, because then there's a few points that I've made notes about from some other things I would also like to address. First of all, there was a question about investment timing, right? So again, key to the apparel textile industry in Africa and under AGOA is building these textile mills, having those inputs available. I'll give a real-world example of our own, right? We've already engaged with the IFC. We've gone through due diligence and everything to establish a new textile mill in Ghana, right, which would be a unique fabric that eliminates 99% of the water use from traditional fabric and the way it's dyed, right? This is a somewhere $15 to $20 million investment that we are interested in making.
Sure.
We can't do that today, right? We don't know if AGOA is going to be renewed.
Yeah.
So that is on hold. That's just us. We're just one small player.
That leads to sort of my next question, which is, you've been planning, you've hired thousands of workers.
Yeah.
Based on the idea that AGOA exists and will continue to exist, and I'm sure now, as you're thinking ahead for the company, your strategic planning has to look very different, and there's got to be a lot of questions there.
Yes, it does include. That's why we're interested in looking at doing our own mills, textile mill, and there are others in West Africa who are investing, a couple $100 million that we know of to build out that vertical cotton supply, right? That's key. And that's what's going to happen. But it also goes to like this utilization question about why after 20, 25 years hasn't there been more of an impact? I mean, I think we all know that as a country, we've bought from China, right? For the last 20, 25 years, they made it very easy for us to buy from China. It's not easy to do business in Africa, right? But the Chinese made it very easy and made it very comfortable for all of the brands to just buy everything there. Now, of course, there is this tremendous focus on how can we source elsewhere. And it now is that investment that needs to happen. I would think that over the next 20 years, that if there is a long-term, renewal of AGOA, I think 20 years from now we will see it'll be a completely different conversation than what is having today.
Well said. I'm out of time, but thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Smucker. I now recognize Ms. Sewell from Alabama.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank you and the ranking member for having this hearing. I'm a very strong supporter of AGOA, and I really appreciate our conversation today has heightened the fact that it is a bipartisan and bicameral support for renewal of AGOA. I, in recent months, have met directly with AGOA country leadership, civil society, and the business communities about the importance of AGOA, but also about what we could do to improve it. I most recently traveled with Chairman Jason Smith on a trade codel to Africa. We visited Benin, we visited Mauritius and Madagascar, and I can tell you that a lot of the countries were really nervous about reauthorization and were requesting it be reauthorized this year, partly because of what you said, Mr. Richmond. Companies need to have assurances. You are placing bets on materials, supply chain, way into the future and want some assurances. I also know that reauthorization without trying to reform would be a missed opportunity. When I think about the kinds of reforms, I'm thinking about smoothing out graduation requirements. I'm talking about, you said something about the annual review process and making it either biannual or every 3 years. Consider strengthening our labor and environmental standards for them, as well as looking at strengthening enforcement generally. Having said all of that, I want to kind of go along the lines that my colleague Linda Sanchez did. I think it's a missed opportunity if we're not trying to build supply chains within Africa. Instead of just extracting minerals or extracting cotton, how about creating real supply chains? And Mr. Rundy, will you talk a little bit about that and how we can strengthen AGOA and actually strengthen the economic viability of Africa if we're not just extracting, but we're rather helping to build?
Thank you, Congresswoman, and thank you for your leadership on AGOA. So I think after COVID, when the People's Republic of China said they were going to cut off our pills and cut off our ventilators, that was grounds for a divorce. And I think it creates an opportunity for Africa. So in terms of friend-shoring, near-shoring, allied shoring. So having AGOA as sort of a basic rules of the game is critical for that to happen. I do think that, as I mentioned in my testimony, I mean, Africa is a very different place than it was 25 years ago when this was enacted. There are more smart...
And it'll be even more different 25 years from now.
Yeah, it's going to be... and so your trip, I'm sure, made that clear. Mauritius was not a middle-income country 25 years ago.
And
it is now. Now it is.
And it's afraid to graduate,
And it's afraid to graduate because it graduates to nothing and loses it. So I'm very much tracking your comments, Congresswoman. So I think all of the things that you've suggested, I think, make a ton of sense. I think we should, we need to pass AGOA, and then we need to think about a 21st century partnership with Africa. So I think we need to lift our sights and see, I mean, Africa's got a lot more partners. They don't have to wait around for us. There's two generations of successful entrepreneurs. You've met them. They'd like to work with us, but we got to show up.
And also with respect to bilateral agreements, I agree with you that we should be doing those. Can you talk a little bit about the benefits of bilateral agreements in addition to having these trade preference agreements in trade preference programs with AGOA?
Thank you, Congresswoman. So I think we ought to pursue a free trade agreement with Kenya. I think it would set a model for future agreements in Africa. We need to create a path towards bilateral and regional trade agreements with Africa. That was the vision 25 years ago by the folks who were on this dais 25 years ago. I think we should fulfill that vision. I think that so I think we should, I think if we get a free trade right with Kenya, also with the African, the AFCTA, the regional agreement, like
Those would be
train
really
is
great.
leaving the station.
I agree. Mr. Richmond, I was talking about supply chains and creating opportunities, direct opportunities for Africa to not just supply the cotton and then send it abroad to make the apparel. Can you add to that your thoughts on creating better supply chains in Africa?
Yeah, I mean, it's necessary, right? And there are, like I said, there are, I know in Benin and Togo, it's started already to do that. West Africa obviously has a tremendous amount of cotton, and it is a shame that historically it's been sent out and all the value has been extracted elsewhere and re-imported.
Exactly.
But absolutely, that's what needs to happen.
Well, Mr. Chairman, I know that people are anxious to get it reauthorized soon. I think we should really take our time to make sure that we are using this as an opportunity, not just to reauthorize, but to improve and to offer some really meaningful reforms for AGOA as well. Obviously, within mind to pass it in 2025. Thanks.
Thank you, Ms. Sewell. Now I recognize Ms. Fischbach from Minnesota.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I appreciate it, and thank you to all of you for being here. This is critical stuff, and I think it was Mr. Arrington mentioned agriculture, and maybe even Mr. Estes had mentioned it. And I'm from a heavy ag district, and so it's a critical export for us. And one of the things, I think that it was Mr. Estes that just kind of glanced on the pork issue. And it's a huge export. About 30% of the pork produced is exported. But my understanding is that in South Africa, the U.S. pork exports only account for about 1.3% of the pork imported into South Africa, and it is not necessarily that they're not eating pork. It's some unscientific issues, trade barriers that are in line. And maybe Mr. Rundy, if you want, you're nodding, so I'm sure you've got something to add on that.
So first, I eat a lot of bacon, and so thank you. I want to thank the producers of your district for all that they're doing. So please pass that along. I think President Obama had similar concerns about pork in South Africa. And I do think that the pork producers in the United States should be emphasizing the job losses in the United States to these unscientific, unjustified sanitary and phytosanitary barriers. And AGOA has, as I mentioned earlier, that part of it to qualify as the resolution of bilateral trade disputes. This in the Obama administration was seen as a bilateral trade dispute. So I do think that it certainly falls in that category. And then I also think AGOA has provisions to require that these barriers, these unjustified sanitary and phytosanitary barriers, be addressed. And finally, I think that I'd hope that the Biden administration might consider bringing this as a formal complaint to the WTO. So I understand your constituents' concerns, and I share them.
So USTR should be pursuing this. I mean,
absolutely,
really
Congresswoman.
Okay, I appreciate that. And I did, just kind of on another note, as we've been talking, you talk a lot about the free trade agreements. And unfortunately, they're not pursuing them. The Biden administration is not pursuing them right now, and it's very disappointing, not only for ag, but a lot of other industries that are not able to take advantage of those. And as a matter of fact, I was in Ecuador with Chairman Jason Smith on a visit there, and we see China moving in, and we're not pursuing those free trade agreements. And so we're going to really lose out on a lot of what's going on. But you have something to add.
Yeah, thanks, Congresswoman. As I said earlier, our trade with Africa is 1/5 the trade activity with China. In Ecuador, we have pro-American president. There's going to be an election coming up. They had to sign a free trade agreement with China. They really would like to sign one with us. They've been knocking on our door. We're not showing up for them. I think the IDEA Act is okay as a halfway house. I'd like us to have a full free trade agreement with Ecuador. So I agree with you, Congresswoman. And so I think part of it is we can't fight something with nothing. So what's our something?
Yeah, and I absolutely agree, and we really should be pursuing those. And maybe if anybody has anything else to add about maybe ag trade, I mean, I would appreciate any kind of, or any of, no? Okay, well, I will yield back, but I do appreciate you being here, and it is a huge concern, not only ag trade, but free trade. Thanks.
Thank you, Ms. Fischbach. I now recognize from Virginia, Mr. Byer.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much, and thank all of you for being here. Mr. Rundy, I want to follow up on your conversation with Congresswoman Sewell about reforming AGOA. Your Senator Coons and Senator Risch, in a bipartisan way, have proposed that countries maintain high-income status for a period of 5 consecutive years in order to graduate, and others have proposed graduating sectors once they reach certain thresholds rather than graduating the entire country. You know, graduating this sector or that sector. How should we assess the merits of these proposals?
Thank you, Congressman. So I think that the original concept of graduation was to imagine that they would graduate to free trade agreements. Unfortunately, we don't have free trade agreements. My suggestion would be is that we allow them to, African countries, to stay even if they achieve middle income status. So I think the current arrangement certainly isn't workable, with Mauritius basically graduating to nothing and losing their status. So I'd like us to raise our sights and return to an agenda of free trade agreements in Africa, whether it's Kenya and elsewhere. That was the original intent 25 years ago. So I think the Coons-Risch bill is excellent. I have a few quibbles with it, but I think on that specific issue, I think it's, what I would argue for is to keep countries in until there's a time that we have free trade agreements with Africa.
Thank you. Mr. Rundy, I'm also curious about your thoughts on the frequency of AGOA country assessments. You know, one of the criticisms we hear from the private sector is we have to do this every year. And there are proposals to do it every 2 years, every 3 years. What would you think about decreasing the frequency? And would that incentivize firms to invest more in Sub-Saharan Africa?
So I think it's a great idea. I think it's burdensome to the countries, and I think I think every 3 years I think would be an appropriate number, sir.
One last AGOA question. The binary nature of it. You're in or you're not. When countries fall out of compliance, we have no choice. I've talked to U.S. Trade Rep Catherine Tai a number of times about Ethiopia, you know, failing on a human rights thing and getting kicked out. Regardless of the impact that it could have on the long-term stability, regardless of the impact of who it's affecting in the country, you suggest a menu of enforcement options, warnings, probation periods, and the like. What are the advantages to this non-binary approach?
Thank you, Congressman. I think that the Coons-Risch bill has a very good menu. I think AGOA is a trade mechanism, not a political mechanism. I'm sorely tempted to find sticks against South Africa. I think what they're doing with China and Russia is obnoxious. I don't like how they're treating Israel. We can agree or disagree, but I just think that I find that the South African government is, you know, has moved from being non-aligned to something else, and so I can understand the temptation to find a stick. I think we need a menu of options, whether it's formal warnings, probationary periods, and partial termination of benefits. Also, a lot of the sectors that are more pro-West, including agriculture and others that are beneficiaries of AGOA in South Africa, would be unduly punished for the actions of the South African government if we were to use this as a stick.
Great, thank you. Ms. Mujica, you have this unique role as the program director for the Solidarity Center in Ethiopia and other East African countries. So you, probably unlike most of the panel, you come at this from a left of center perspective, from a labor perspective. Can you give us any hope, any sense that there will be a world in which free trade agreements agree again? Clearly, the Biden administration has not been enthusiastic about it. We expect none in the remainder of the year. If in a different world, Ambassador Lighthizer comes back, again, there was no enthusiasm under his leadership for free trade agreements. When can the pro-free and fair trade advocates among us have some hope for free trade agreements again?
Thank you for that question. I'd like to get back to you comprehensively in writing, as I would not want to speak about free trade agreements right now. Thank you.
Well, in my 33 seconds, Mr. Rundy, do you have an opinion?
So I do think, I think all of our trade agreements, starting with the Bretton Woods, with the GATT, had a great power competition push behind it. So I think there are geoeconomic, if I can use that term, geopolitical and geoeconomic drivers oftentimes behind our trade agreements. And I think, I fear that great power competition with China is what's going to bring us back to the table on free trade agreements. So sooner or later, it's going to be that.
Thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Breyer. Next, Mr. Pestoff from Tennessee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the witnesses for appearing today. Mr. Rundy, if I could with you, and I know that my colleague asked about pork, maybe if I could ask about poultry. I represent Tennessee's 8th Congressional District. It's a very heavy ag district. It exports about $2.2 billion worth of agriculture-related products. And so as it relates to poultry, and maybe specifically South Africa, I know that South Africa has been applying prohibitive anti-dumping duties to the U.S. origin poultry since the year 2000, over 20 years. Another factor that has resulted in low quota fill is South Africa's decision, to raise tariff duties on our products. Of course, there are other categories of U.S. poultry that does not have access to the market. Talk about fair market access for our products. It's important, I think, to all of us, certainly to my district. Could you talk specifically, though, about South Africa's current trade restrictions on U.S. ag products, and how do these barriers impact U.S. farmers and U.S. producers?
So I eat a lot of bacon, I also eat a lot of chicken, so I want to thank your constituents. But I also think poor people around the world rely on cows and they rely on chickens for their protein. And so I think we should enact pro-poor agricultural policies in the global south. So we should be supporting animal husbandry as part of supporting food security in general. As I said earlier, the Obama administration had concerns about pork, and I also believe poultry back in 2015 with South Africa. So this is not a new issue that we have. This is a pain point in our relationship with South Africa. As I said earlier, the resolution of bilateral trade disputes is part of AGOA eligibility, and AGOA has the provisions that require that barriers to U.S. exports be eliminated, including unjustified sanitary and phytosanitary barriers. I know that there have been, I think, there have been concerns about avian flu, but I also understand that there have been sort of major progress in that area in the United States in terms of our poultry. So I eat it every day with no concern, so I would hope our friends in South Africa would do the same. I do think, Congressman, I think that we should be documenting job losses for the American poultry producers as part of this holdup, and I think we should be demonstrating that. And then finally, I would hope that the Biden administration would consider even a formal WTO formal complaint on this issue of poultry vis-a-vis South Africa, Congressman.
Thank you, Mr. Rundy. If I could, maybe in a different area, I know in your testimony you said that the United States is not going to displace China on the continent or match it, the investment dollar for dollar, but we could compete in certain sectors. So what are the sectors you think that we can be competitive in?
So I certainly think there's certain components in the digital space, though I think that's the case. I certainly don't want, as China moves into whether so I think, so digital is one. I'd like us also to think whether it's healthcare, whether it's pharmaceuticals. I also think manufacturing. I also think certainly we're very competitive in agriculture. So I do think they also, given sort of these global shifts in supply chains, we want to offer ourselves and should offer ourselves as a partner with Africa to build this next level of, they don't want to just be in the extractive business. It's not the continent of 25 years ago. To the extent that we have a positive forward-looking agenda that speaks to their hopes and aspirations in terms of their economies, we should be seen as not just, I think China is seen as an extractive partner. We need to be seen as an additive partner, Congressman.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Kustoff. I now recognize Mr. Schneider from Illinois.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank the witnesses for first sharing your insights and perspectives. This has been very helpful, but also your patience as we work our way through the day. I want to thank the chair and committee for calling this hearing today. Africa and Haiti are crucial to U.S. interests, and I'm going to touch a little bit on each. As a member of, and in fact the only member of both the House Committee on Ways and Means and the House Foreign Affairs Committee, I am proud that so much of our work is dedicated to America's global leadership around the world. I often say that the U.S. is at its best when we lead with our friends and allies, not just looking at the bottom line, but looking at our strategic interests broadly in a way that is shared with our allies and reflecting the moral clarity of our values-based vision for the future. Of course, there's much strategically to be gained from working with African countries, allies in Africa. It is a young population and some of the world's fastest growing economies, as was noted today. But more than that, it's crucial that African countries, friends and partners to the U.S., we recognize them as such and that we work together towards a world that is more just, fair, and sustainable. As was said earlier, my colleague Terry Sewell mentioned it, Mr. Runda, you touched on it. We need to work to reauthorize, but not just reauthorize, but to enhance and improve AGOA. And I look forward to working on this committee to doing that. I want to focus all of my questions on Haiti. Abraham Lincoln, our greatest president, and I will note proudly a fellow Illinoisan, was the first U.S. president to recognize Haiti. Since then, the relationship has been complex, but always crucial, whether geopolitically or due to the strong ties between the diaspora and the island. Today, Haiti is facing one of its greatest challenges since independence. We're witnessing a near collapse of the state, and I hope the Republicans on the House Foreign Affairs Committee and the Senate Foreign Relations Committee will come to unblock the crucial funds to help restore calm. As the administration works with our allies, especially Kenya, to stabilize the situation in Haiti, we must also think about the future. We must do everything in our power to ensure that the future of Haiti is not just a recovery, but includes prosperity and security, and that our private sector is able, willing, and committed to investing to lift up the Haitian people. So let me ask Ms. Mojica and Mr. Runde, what can we in Congress do to best help Haiti going forward? The surge in foreign direct investment that followed Hope 1, Hope 2, and HELP in the early part of this century is something this body can and should be proud of. As Secretary Blinken recently noted, Hope HELP is a vital program. And as you talk, I'll leave the question there for now.
Thank you, Mr. Schneider. Unfortunately, I'm not an expert on Haiti, but the Solidarity Center's Haiti team is happy to get back to you comprehensively in writing.
Mr. Runde, any thoughts?
So the best social program in the world is a job. And I would hope that we renew this year the Haiti Hope Act. I think we've talked about making adjustments to AGOA, and so that may be a little bit more complicated. I would ask in all humility that the Congress coalesce around one bill. I know there's multiple bills. There's a number of folks who have said they care about Haiti. The best thing we could do is coalesce around one bill, even potentially get to unanimous consent around one bill. And I think companies are leaving now. I believe it's the 7th largest source of undocumented people crossing our border, the southern border, are from Haiti. We're going to have more people. If we don't have jobs, we're going to have all sorts of bad things happen. Of course, there needs to be a political settlement in Haiti. Of course, there needs to be some sort of a security arrangement. I know that there's been, but we have to start with getting this renewed.
I hear you in one. I will note, and maybe you have thoughts on this, but our colleague Stacy Plaskett has the Hope for Haitian Prosperity Act of 2023. Do you have any thoughts on what that could do, or we can bring that up in a later conversation?
I have opinions on many things, Congressman. I don't have a view on the different, there's at least 3 different bills, if I understand it, sir, and maybe a 4th. All I would ask is that Congress in its wisdom coalesce around one bill, sir.
I hear you. I concur, and we need to do more to help Haiti in a very difficult moment. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Schneider. I now recognize Ms. Moore from Wisconsin.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for allowing me to wave on this subcommittee. I want to thank the witnesses for a tremendous education here this afternoon. I have questions for all of you. So many questions, so little time. So bear with me. Ms. Mejia, I'm going to ask you this question, and I may ask others it too. What, in your opinion, or your research, has prevented a really good vertical integration within the African continent to make them more productive? I mean, you got a lot of cotton there, but then they have to send the cotton off to Asia to get it processed. And I think one of our witnesses talked about the different colors, Mr. Richmond. What could AGOA do, in your opinion, to promote vertical integration?
Thank you for that question. Please allow us to get back to you in writing.
Okay. How about you? Should I ask Mr. Richmond, Mr. Rundy? Who wants to volunteer?
Sure, I'll go ahead. Thank you.
Okay.
Look, it takes investment in terms of investment dollars and expertise, right? Building that out, it's not rocket science, right? But it does take a lot of money in terms of equipment. It takes expertise. I mentioned 5,600 people working for us. So we have 100 expats that we've brought from Sri Lanka and Bangladesh and Philippines and all over to transfer that knowledge, right? Just like China wasn't China 20, 30, 40 years ago, they had to learn. So,
Mr. Nasser, okay, let me ask you, Mr. Nasser, really quick. Kenya, we're about to go to Kenya in a couple of days, and I know that they are recipients of AGOA, but they may, quote unquote, graduate. What do you think would be the consequences of them graduating at this time in their development?
Thanks for the question, Congresswoman Moore. We have a small supply chain in Kenya. It's about 5% of our imports. I'm not familiar with the specifics of a graduation program for them, so I can't comment.
Though, because people have commented. Okay, Mr. Rundy, come on, help us out here.
Thank you, Congresswoman. I'm a Packers fan, so I'm happy.
All right, see, I knew that.
That's good. So graduation, look, it's Congresswoman, I think it's would be a terrible thing for whether it's Mauritius or other countries in Africa. As I said earlier, AGOA was set up as a halfway house to move towards free trade agreements. I hope we can restart dialogue about a free trade agreement with Kenya. So having a country become middle income and then graduate from AGOA to nothing is a disaster. I would suggest that we keep all the countries in AGOA until such time as we have free trade, we work towards free trade agreements, Congresswoman.
Okay. Now, Mr. Rundy, while I've got you here, you had an interesting discourse with the gentlelady from West Virginia about minerals. And you said something like, oh boy, people would hate going into mining. Then you went on to talk about how we need to really lean into that. Can you really clarify for me? Because I'm very interested in the exploitation, and I guess, Ms. Makia would agree with that. A lot of the exploitation that occurs in this sector, and as we move into needing these critical minerals, can you clarify for me what you meant?
Yes, Congresswoman, what I was trying to say is that we need minerals, and we're going to need a lot more minerals in the future. I believe that the American people are not going to want to transfer, moving from the internal combustion engine to electric vehicles and electric batteries if they're controlled by the Chinese Communist Party. I also believe, though, that...
So is this a space where AGOA could skip in?
I think so. I mean, I think what I would say is that we need to be supporting clean, fair, equitable activities in mining and minerals. We need to raise standards. There are many fine mining companies around the world, many of them U.S. companies, British companies, Australian companies. I think it's
And they could benefit as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
I only have 30 seconds left. I'm sorry to cut you off. And I have to really ask Ms. Mukia a question again. I was on an airplane and some woman squeezed herself into a middle seat because that's all that was left there. And I really got depressed by the time I was finished talking to her because she works for an international environmental organization. And she says that everybody in the development world knows that as soon as you go in and start helping women and empowering women and lifting women up, people in the community who are most likely to use that money to spend it on uplifting the family, that the instant you do that, domestic violence skyrockets. I was so depressed after I got off that plane, sitting next to her. Can you tell me what, if anything, you propose in the way of programming to alleviate this outcome?
Thank you for that question, and I do not think I agree with that analogy, but
Okay.
we know that labor rights, or labor in general, is an intersectional issue. For example, women's rights are critical to upholding labor rights. Policies that hold back women, governments that do not appoint women to leadership positions, and employers who do not maintain a safe workplace free from gender-based violence are stifling the advancement of labor rights in general. So my only response would be that we cannot stop supporting the advancement of women just because of a different...
I think I saw you shaking your head or doing something, Mr. Rundy. Any thoughts on that? Oh, you, Mr. Richmond?
Sure. I mean, I'll just say, I mean, again, as you know, we employ 76% women. In fact, our local partner in Ghana is a Ghanaian woman. The studies I've seen show that, you know, when women bring home money, that it's more likely to go towards supporting the family and the things it should go to than otherwise. So, I mean, we're big believers in providing those opportunities.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Ranking Member. Thank you for your indulgence. Thank you for having this hearing. Thank you for letting me wave on, and I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Moore. Certainly thank you to all my colleagues. I deferred on my questions, but I certainly appreciate the participation here today. It's been robust with just about 100% participation of all subcommittee members. I think it speaks to the fact that for what we need right now in the world, Africa offers many, many solutions, offers examples of what the right thing to do is, unassociated with a commercial name, obviously, but I think that this opportunity gives us a chance to analyze where we've been, where we need to go. So let me just say, Mr. Rundy, you've touched a bit on some concerns about South Africa. Make no mistake, they enjoy vast benefits of AGOA, and yet I think they're undermining our foreign policy. Their partnership with Mr. Putin and attacking Israel through the International Court of Justice, these are concerning issues, intellectual property protections that are lacking, and let me add that they're attempting also to expropriate American IP through the TRIPS waiver process. Again, I think undermining our interests, even when our interests are helping the world. And so I'm very, very concerned about that, and I think this is an opportunity for us to look further in modernizing how we handle AGOA moving forward. You know, there's an enthusiasm to make necessary changes to kind of lift our expectations. But I, too, was with the colleagues around Africa a few weeks back, where we've seen great examples of what's working, whether it was in Mauritius or Benin, other places. So let's see more of that, but also let's not have our trading partners who are doing the right thing all along the way and utilizing AGOA and then nowhere else to go. I mean, it's hard to even call it graduation when it's a dead end. And we owe ultimately the American people better policy through this effort. And so I would hope that we could dig deeper. I hear the comments here, and I think an appetite for a trade agreement with Kenya. I'm beginning to wonder that the only people opposed to a trade agreement with Kenya happen to be at the White House. How unfortunate. Because as I engage with colleagues here in the legislative branch, there is this appetite and enthusiasm to get going here. Let's get things done. And this is bipartisan. Certainly on the heels of USMCA that has been bipartisan as well. So, Mr. Rundy, can you perhaps examine further? You said that a complaint filed through the WTO on South Africa would be in order. Would you like to elaborate, or could you elaborate on that a bit?
I would just say that I understand the temptation to use AGOA as a stick, but I'm trying to resist that temptation. They have been a bad actor. They're undermining American foreign policy on a number of fronts, and but I do think we've had to work at our relationship with South Africa. And so, as I said earlier, the Obama administration had similar concerns on certain agricultural products, and I believe they found ways to work with them. So I think we have a fabulous ambassador in Ambassador Ruben Brigady. I think he represents us very, very well. I'm a great admirer of his. And so I know that he has a very difficult job there, but I do think that some of it needs to be behind closed doors, some of it needs to be through calling attention to it through Congress, and then I think to the extent that we can use actions, whether through having a dialogue through the AGOA process, but also through the WTO, I think these are all things that we ought to be looking at, Chairman.
Thank you. Now, on Kenya, do you have any numbers by chance in terms of what they're already benefiting from, and perhaps how we could benefit more through a bilateral trade agreement that there's so much support for?
I don't, sir, but what I'll do is I'll come back to you with some brief thoughts in writing for the record.
Okay, no,
I'll do
appreciate
some
that.
homework, Chairman.
I appreciate that. I know that we've been told repeatedly from the administration that they're not leading on any trade agreements because they don't have the votes. I would challenge that assertion based on the discussion we've had here today and other engagements I've had both sides of the aisle in terms of what we should be doing, like with Kenya. The fact that the Trump administration teed up a trade agreement with Kenya and that the current administration is unwinding, stepping back from, and yet having a discussion as long as it doesn't involve tariffs. Certainly other colleagues have touched on other barriers, non-tariff trade barriers, again, back to South Africa. But wow, there is just so much opportunity for, I would hope, South Africa to improve where they stand with our country right now, but also exactly what we need. Our challenges now with China can be resolved with building relationships, as Mr. Richmond has pointed out. There are great opportunities there. And Mr. Richmond, anything you would like to add to previous comments?
Well, I mean, if you would indulge me, I'd like to actually ask a very naive question.
Okay. Go ahead.
And that is, I've heard everybody say that they're in favor of renewal, reauthorization of AGOA, but want to take the opportunity to make improvements. And it's a one-sided, right? It's a unilateral agreement, right? So I guess my naive question is, what prevents you from reauthorizing it as is to give the certainty to investors and yet still work on all of the improvements you want and enacting those when you have agreed to those so that it provided that stability but still the opportunity? Like, that's the part I'm naive about.
You raise the concerns about predictability and stability. I think that's very important, and just as a gauge, and as we have discussions and I get various points of input from colleagues and stakeholders, the urgency to renew it is very present. So I think that, looking at it, and there are also the expectations, though, that along with that urgency, we need to deal with some of these things, such as the dead end of so-called graduation. We're going to have to deal with that. Now, that won't all be resolved, in my opinion, when we know we need a trade agreement, say with Kenya, a bilateral trade agreement with Kenya, comprehensive, and then take Mauritius, a great example of what we set out to accomplish. They're doing the right thing. What's next? We won't resolve all of that in a renewal, in my opinion, but I think that we need to really examine and put pressure on the administration, for example, to show some leadership where the executive branch is most appropriate to lead in these areas. I cannot emphasize that enough. So whether it's agriculture that we've heard about, or textiles, adding value, the opportunities are many to make some corrections, but also build what can be, I think, a very bright future, especially with the fastest growing continent in terms of population, and just so many opportunities. So with that, again, thank you to our witnesses for joining us here today. Please be advised that members have 2 weeks to submit written questions to be answered later in writing. Those questions and your answers will be made part of the formal hearing record. With that, the subcommittee stands adjourned. Thank you again.
Good job, Vic.